Hello and welcome back to the Nebraskabilities podcast. I am your host, Andy, with my lovely co hosts, Nate and Zach. And not to anybody's surprise, Nebraska falls Saturday to Oklahoma 49-14 in Mickey Joseph's first game as interim coach. And I got to tell you, throughout last week, I was slowly chugging the Kool-Aid of Mickey Joseph as being a head coach. I was sitting there thinking, oh, I know how bad this team is, but man, we got a new voice at the helm. Mickey Joseph's going to come out, and they showed that tunnel walk Saturday. He was fired up, getting his players fired up, came out, holding his hands up, getting the crowd ready, saying, here's our team, we're ready to play. And you could just feel the energy in Memorial Stadium just shift, and we were ready to go. The first 3 minutes of the game were fun, and after that, boy, did it go very, very south for the Nebraska Cornhuskers here. With that, not a whole lot to talk about in terms of positives for the game. Special teams, probably the brightest spot. Didn't really have a whole lot of mess ups to be concerned about in terms of turnovers or onside kicks or taking punts out 5 yards or more type thing. Offense, very first drive of the game, fantastic. Defense, first two drives of the game, made Oklahoma punt, went 3-and-out, looked fantastic. And the minute that Dylan Gabriel ran that 61-yard touchdown to the house, showed just how bad the Nebraska defense still is and still will forever be bad. Other big news coming out of Saturday after the game, not really Saturday, but Sunday afternoon, Trev Alberts announced again that Mickey Joseph had decided to relieve Eric Chinander of his duties as defensive coordinator and made Bill Bush the defensive coordinator the rest of the season. Bill Bush, if for those that don't remember, has had a lot of experiences being a defensive and special teams coordinator in the past. So this was a no-brainer for who to call up as the defensive coordinator for the rest of the season here. But with that, we'll go to Nate for just his quick initial thoughts before we get into the meat of the game.
Yeah, so I guess my initial thoughts are still somewhat optimistic. I think we talked about last week how it's kind of a tall ask for Mickey Joseph with Oklahoma, number 6 team in the nation coming in. I mean, it's you want him to do well, you want him to kind of go out there and show kind of what he has, but I don't know. I think there's definitely room for improvement, but wasn't necessarily the showing everyone was hoping for, I guess. And so, still a lot of the same issues that have plagued this team under the Scott Frost regime, but there were the first few minutes at least. It looked like there was a lot more intensity, which was nice to see. We came out against the number 6 team in the nation, scored on our first drive, had a good defensive drive as well, and so there were some really initial good positives. I remember watching the game with Andy turn to him, and for a split second, I was like, "Man, we might win this game." Obviously, that went downhill pretty quick, but there was at least some hope, some optimism, I guess, initially with the game, and so not ready to jump off the Mickey Joseph bandwagon just yet. I think we need to give him a little more time, certainly. We'll see kind of how things shake out with Big Ten play starting in a couple weeks here. But I guess, like you mentioned, Andy, the other big news from the game was that Chinander was fired or relieved of his duties. And so that was, as much as I want to say it was surprising, it wasn't terribly surprising, but it was a little bit I was at least taken aback to hear that just after one game already, Chinander was fired. I was okay with the decision, but I was definitely taken aback by it. Just the timing of it, with kind of how there have been so many changes recently with the program. But overall, I'm all right with the decision. Bill Bush should be decent. I think, like you mentioned, he had some defensive coordinator experience with LSU, and so that should help us hopefully moving forward. But overall, I was more or less whelmed with the game. It wasn't again, it wasn't shocking that we lost or even in the way that we lost, but it was just kind of another game, I guess. So, but with that, I guess I will close my thoughts there and pass it over to Zach here.
You bet. I kind of have the same thoughts, really. It basically was not a surprise that we lost. I guess when I say we weren't supposed to win, I guess that's not me being pessimistic at all. I don't think anybody expected us to trounce number 6 in the country. And Brett Venables definitely showed up and brought his team to play, and they were ready to go. I was not at all surprised by Chins getting fired. I was, I guess, happy with the decision, which is unfortunate because everything else that I had heard about Chins, the guy, was he was a great guy, but it wasn't being put together on the field. And obviously, I think it was a good call, which that actually goes back to what I had said last week when I had mentioned that Trev mentioned that Mickey was going to make significant changes. But then, like 2 days later, there wasn't really anything real big announced. I think we saw the significant changes all of a sudden. And again, I think that was a good one. Not really a whole lot to talk about, I guess, overall for the game for me. You guys pretty much hit on everything I wanted to talk about. Outside, I mean, there was just not a lot of good. The special teams was probably the shining star, but that's probably because the special teams wasn't on the field very much. They were when they had to be, but they didn't have any issues that I saw. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add there, so I'm going to pass it back to Andy and let's get into the meat of the game.
So with our offensive staff here, not really the staff, but the game going forward. Like I said, first drive, fantastic. You go out, you go down, I think, 77 yards, score the touchdown. Nice pass over the middle to, oh God, I already forgot who scored. Trey Palmer. There we go. Trey Palmer right out of the gate. And like Nate had said, we had turned, looked at each other, and they go, "Oh yes, this is it. The energy is fired up. We're gonna win this game. We're gonna go out and do it." And then we saw how the rest of the game went. I saw a stat at halftime that Nebraska went that first drive, like 9 plays, 77 yards, scored the touchdown. The rest of the drives after that in the second half was about 37 plays for like 76 yards that they did the entire rest of that first half. And that is kind of the moral of the game of what else you need to know about it is that they just did absolutely nothing on offense. Brett Venables showing you as Oklahoma coach why his defense has always been so stout, and he is very much a defensive minded coach for that. In terms of players that looked good, despite Casey having absolutely no time in the pocket whatsoever because of our trash offensive line. 14 for 20, 129 yards and a touchdown for that as well. He did run it a couple times, but not much. I know in college football you get negative rushing yards for sacks, so he had like minus 30 yards for rushing, but all of those were probably because he was sacked every single time for that as well. Uh, Receiving wise, Trey Palmer led the team with 10 catches for, I think, 92 yards there in that lone touchdown. Next closest receiver were tied with Marcus Washington and Brody Belt with 2 catches. So it's clear that Casey and Trey have developed a good chemistry in terms of pass catch on that spectrum. Again, there wasn't a whole lot with the offense, though. They were not on the field that often, despite Nebraska surprisingly winning the time of possession by a minute. And you look at that as one of those things in the Scott Frost era where you would think, man, if you just win the time of possession, you kill the clock, you're probably going to win the game. And more often than not, that is true. But in this case, when you let Oklahoma score on 40 plus yards, 60 plus yards, the 20 plus yard rushes they had for touchdowns, that kills a lot of the momentum for obviously your defense, but it kills a lot of the game. And to think that, oh, Oklahoma didn't have the ball that often, how did they win so by so much? It's because we let them score on these massive touchdown runs for that as well. Running back wise, Gabe Ervin technically led the team in rushing yards despite that being against Oklahoma's second string defense. Our first string running backs, AJ Allen, Anthony Grant, did get stuffed a lot at the line. Not a whole lot of running room for either back today, or I guess Saturday there, for our, again, trash offensive run block line there for that. I had also saw a stat that this was the first game out of the first 3 games for Anthony Grant that he had finally been tackled for a loss officially for the season. So that just tells you how good of a player that Anthony Grant was the first 3 games. And I don't think to this day that we win that North Dakota game without Anthony Grant making some of those amazing runs and some of those amazing plays there for that as well. For that, though, backup quarterback, I mean, Chuba got in there in garbage time. Despite the 1 interception, I mean, it looked like his package set, if he ever came into a game, it looked a lot of like what we ran with Adrian, a lot of RPO, a lot of Chuba rolling out. If he sees the first down, take off type thing. And I probably that is by design. We knew that Casey was more of a passing quarterback rather than a running quarterback going into the game. Whipple knows that as well, but Chuba ran for that touchdown, got the other 7 points for the end of the game there. So I also thought it was very funny that Nebraska scored the very first possession and their very last possession of the game as well. But yeah, outside of that, I mean, offense, not a whole other lot to say other than our trash offensive line needs to be, in the quote that Zach loves to use, is fired into the sun for that. But outside of that, I'll pass it over to Nate. See if what do you got on your offensive thoughts for the game, Nate?
My offensive thoughts are pretty offensive. Overall, it was just outside of that first drive or so, just didn't look like a whole lot of effort was going into play calling and just play execution. That first drive really, like I said, just gave me some hope that, okay, maybe we're finding our groove or we can at least kind of compete in a big game like this. And I was really impressed with how we moved the ball pretty efficiently downfield, and then it culminated in that Trey Palmer touchdown for I believe it was 32 yards if I remember right. So not a terribly long play, but it was a nice pass by Casey. One of those pinpoint precision type passes that we see from him quite a bit, at least when he's feeling confident. That's kind of one of the things I've noticed with Casey is that there are times where some of his passes are right on the money, and then other times they can just be way out of left field. So that is something interesting I've noticed watching Casey play. Could certainly be a product of that offensive line, though, because turns out when you have more time to throw, you probably make better decisions, make better throws. Our offensive line excels at not allowing that to happen, which is unfortunate, but it is kind of what we're stuck with. So I think biggest offensive takeaway has to be just that we actually scored some points on offense. That's kind of what surprises me the most. I mean, there were multiple times where Oklahoma's defense was in our backfield within the first few seconds. Multiple times we've already talked about where we would see offensive linemen just completely missing their assignments and letting guys run in willy-nilly without even being touched. And so you can't be doing that as an offense, but it just makes the fact that we actually scored points and had some positive plays that much more impressive, I guess. But honestly, after that first drive, things really stalled. Play calling was kind of so-so. It's tough to tell just because the offense was so stagnant, couldn't really get anything going. Tough to really tell if that was the play calling or if that was just a product of the offense not really being able to do much against a pretty top-notch defense. And so that'll be something to, I guess, look forward to as we move into Big Ten play. But then otherwise, you mentioned it, Andy. Trey Palmer was the really bright spot, 10 catches, which is pretty impressive. for 92 yards. A little less impressive, but had a lone touchdown. Clearly, Trey Palmer is going to be, or has that chemistry with Casey, and is going to be our clear-cut wide receiver number 1. So that's at least a positive. And then, interestingly enough, our running backs we had Gabe Irvin, obviously in garbage time, racked up the most, but AJ Allen and Anthony Grant both held under 50 yards, no touchdowns. Really interesting to see that we at least got a couple different guys in there. Obviously, it was garbage time, but it was nice to see some of the fresh blood in there, like our Gabe Irvins, our Jacquez Yance, with AJ Allen and Anthony Grant not being as efficient as they have been. So that was positive to at least see we're willing to give some other guys a chance. But other than that, yeah, really just lackluster from the offense in general. And hopefully, having a bye week coming up soon, we will be able to, I don't know, at least rejuvenate the offense to kind of where they were against some of our other opponents. But with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Zach on any of his thoughts.
I think for me, it's kind of fair to say, just as in a general sense for the offense, that our skill positions are doing really well with what they're given. Nate, you just said that Anthony Grant and AJ Allen they didn't perform as well, but there were still some good runs that they both had. I remember while watching the game, at least in the first quarter, thinking, yeah, they still look like they're performing well. Unfortunately, they're going up against a much more strong opponent, and that showed because, again, I think the big key point with the offense is that the offensive line couldn't fight themselves out of a wet paper bag. It was just poor execution, poor technique, and the fact that we all were able to pinpoint specific spots where somebody just completely missed a blocking assignment. And I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, I might get this wrong numbers wise, but I'm pretty sure the same player made 3 complete whiffs for a block in that first drive, in the first couple drives, I guess. Like, you could count the times that Casey got sacked, or at least got touched by the defense, that it was because of this player. And it's just that was the telling story for me. Outside of the line, the skill positions did what they could, but they can't do much when you're only given a second or two to actually react and do your thing. So I really don't know what anybody would expect from them based on what we had there. I think for me, even with the positives, quote unquote, that we had with what we saw on offense from the skill positions, the offensive line just drags down so much more. And which actually makes, and this kind of goes for both sides too, is it makes me wonder what our strength and conditioning coach, Mr. Duval, is doing, because we see all these hype up videos over the summer of these guys lifting, 400 and 500 pounds, or squatting that much and doing just ridiculous amount of weight, which is great if you're going to be a bodybuilder. But it makes me wonder, like, are we losing technique in doing that? Because football is not just about the strongest guy on the field. That certainly helps. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but it seems like, especially in the offensive line, the technique is just gone, or not there. And, I know that's probably rich coming from me, who would get eaten alive by a lineman. But still, there was so much that was not was not as exciting to watch, because every time Casey would get confident or even get on fire, he'd get a couple passes or a couple good runs. We'd go to do a third down, maybe a long pass, and he'd get sacked for 10 yards because our offensive line couldn't stop anything. And I have questions about it, but unfortunately, those questions will probably remain unanswered until we see who the next staff is. But yeah, I'm probably the more pessimistic one out of the three of us, but I was impressed with about 5 or 6 people on the offense, and that's about it. Outside of that, I knew by the start of the third quarter, I was like, I think I watched the game, but I was not excited to watch the rest of the game. With that, I will pass it to Andy then.
So on to defense now. Again, biggest news coming out of after the game on Sunday. Uh, Trev and Mickey, I guess really Mickey deciding to. I'll take back what I said earlier. It was Mickey that made the decision to fire Chinander. His exact quote for the press release was, "We appreciate Eric and the work and dedication he has given to our football program. At this time, I feel it is in the best interest of the Nebraska football program to take the leadership of the defense in another direction, and decided Bill Bush will take over the defensive coordinator." End quote from Mickey Joseph there. Zach's going back to your favorite quote. Like you said last week, fire Chinander into the sun, and Mickey Joseph sure did that, didn't he?
I'm just glad to see that someone took my advice seriously. Now, I hope he didn't actually fire him into a rocket into the sun. That might cause a lot of questions, but hey, it's nice to know that someone out there's listening. So props to you, Mickey.
Right.
Everyone knows Mickey's an avid listener of the Nebraskabilities podcast.
Yes, he is. But with that, first drive of the game, it's great. All the energy of the game helped that defense, got them the first stop. Uh, Second drive then was the Dylan Gabriel touchdown, and things went down from there. What I had feared going into this game was you can have all the emotion, you can have all that mentality behind you, as we saw in the first offensive drive and first defensive drive. But playing in an emotional filled game cannot sustain you all four quarters. And it proved after that touchdown, Dylan Gabriel's touchdown, that this defense was ready to get shelled, and they got more than shelled for that. And I think we had talked about in our opening podcast that we were all kind of unsure of how Oklahoma was going to be this year after the Lincoln Riley fallout. And we knew that Brett Venables was a defensive guy, and coming in as a first-year head coach, you never know with a new program. They almost had almost an entire roster turnover too, and we just had no idea how they were going to look.
And boy, were we wrong.
Boy, do they look like a playoff team, and we make every team look like a playoff team against us.
Number 6 is probably pretty accurate for them, let's be
Yeah.
honest.
Yep.
So much is yet to be said about Oklahoma. Obviously, the rest of the year will tell that for us. But yeah, I think Zach had told me during our text chain during the game is we make any team that plays us look like an all-star caliber playoff team. Probably going to be the theme for the rest of the season. And we had also mentioned this last week. We just were not sure, with Mickey as a new voice and a new leadership, how much true change we were going to see, within 5-6 days of him taking the realm. Didn't think it would be a blowout. I know after so many close losses, after so many close games, we were eventually due for a blowout, and it happened. I was not in the least bit surprised or shocked about how the game went, how the defense played. Uh, the past 3 games proved to me that this defense was definitely going to get shelled by Oklahoma, and they sure did. Uh, just it still goes back to coaching, just the angles. I keep going back to that Dylan Gabriel run because it never should have been a 61-yard touchdown. There were about 2 or 3 players that just took horrific angles trying to tackle him, and all of them missed because they all took awful angles. And Tommy Hill, as much as I thought he was going to be a standout cornerback, he got picked on all game. On that play, he was probably blocked 20 yards downfield by one of the Oklahoma wide receivers. He just has not lived up to what we all thought he was going to be in the offseason. And that's to say with a lot of our defense, especially our DBs, the secondary is such a concern going forward in terms of pass coverage, in terms of man coverage. I think Zach had mentioned at one point is, as much as they praise talent on the defense, there's a reason why we don't play man every single play on defense. It's because we do not have the fatigue, the stamina, the talent to play man against Oklahoma. Nonetheless, you probably will have some all-star or all-conference wide receivers on that team for sure by the end of the year. Marvin Mims, especially, is probably going to be close to first or second team All-American, if I were to guess. But it just proves that this defense, once again, you can have all the emotion, all the mentality of you're going to win, you're going to win. But if you do not go out there and prove it, and if you, it comes down to the trenches. That game was definitely won and lost in the trenches on both sides of the ball. Defensive wise, just got pushed around. Yeah, those touchdown runs in the second half by their running backs. I mean, those were just, you could walk 2 or 3 guys through the holes that they opened there. Our defensive line just got manhandled on in the trenches. Our linebackers, just every time a linebacker would come up to plug a hole, I mean, there was an Oklahoma guy or lineman just waiting there to block the hole. And that just goes back to great coaching on the Oklahoma staff, knowing what they had to do coming into this game. And it just proves why Oklahoma is a top tier team in the country. But I would not be surprised if, they kind of run the table, if they'll be in the playoffs or at least in the playoffs discussion towards the end of the year. Um, Brett Venables just knows what he's doing with that team, and we have absolutely no idea what we're doing with our team. Hence why we fired our head coach and all of that, or our head coach and our defensive coordinator too. And who knows what else we're going to see with that going forward. But I will be interested to see what Mickey Joseph talks about tomorrow on Tuesday in his weekly press conference there. I'm sure he'll be asked and addressed about the Chinander firing, thoughts about going forward with Bill Bush as defensive coordinator, what he's going to do the rest of the season. Um, and I'm sure he'll be asked if there's going to be any more interim coaching changes. And we'll talk about the discussion of this later towards the end of the defensive comments here of just how long are we going to see the ripple effects of Scott's tenure here, what he left for us, what coaches he left for us, and just how bad it was internally for coaching. But with that, Nate, I'll pass it to you for any defense comments.
Yeah, so the big news, I guess, just Chinander's out, and I think it was a decision that needed to be made. Again, it was a little surprising timing wise, but Mickey knows what he's doing. I have full confidence in Mickey that he knows kind of how to run the program, and if someone's not getting the job done, someone's not getting the job done. He's willing to make the changes necessary to catapult the team forward. And so that's, I guess, positive to see from that front. At least he's at least willing to make the changes, or at least make changes that might be necessary to move forward as a team. And so that'll be interesting to see the ramifications of that. But honestly, you can't really get too much worse defensive wise. So maybe coaching change is all we need. Maybe Bill Bush should be a little tougher on him. And but I know tackling has been really our Achilles heel. Andy, you mentioned it. The angles that we're taking are just abhorrent. I know when we were watching the game, there were times where you're just looking at us trying to pursue whoever has the ball, and it isn't clicking for whatever reason. And I don't know if that's a practice thing, a scheme thing, something to do with not practicing tackling as much, but it really does show the product has been really lackluster. And so that's something that needs to be addressed, I think. And it seems like from all the comments I've been reading about, that we're actually starting to do live tackling, which is just insane that we weren't doing that before as a football team.
Which I
But
do think it was Miles Farmers in the press conference after the game that he had mentioned that they had been tag practicing during practice, which for those who don't know, tagging essentially is just two-hand touch in practice.
yep, I know there's probably some sort of stipulations on the amount of tackling you can do in this day and age in practice, but to not have any live tackling whatsoever really, I guess, defines why, or kind of shows why the defense has been as bad as they have. If they're not practicing the fundamentals in practice, that's going to translate out to your on-field product. And so we've really been seeing that. But looking at some of the stats, I mean, Oklahoma had no issues passing it. They only had 268 passing yards, so that part wasn't necessarily the main issue. It's just the run defense. We got gashed for 312 yards on the ground, which not necessarily surprising or unheard of, but just a little disappointing that there wasn't at least some adjustments made from the Georgia Southern game where we gave up over 600 yards. I think we ended up giving just a little over 500 yards to Oklahoma. But just seeing that there wasn't that much of a, and granted there were only 6-7 days to turn things around a bit, but just to see that there wasn't really that much difference in what the defense was doing was a little uninspiring, I guess. But yeah, everything from the tackling to the D line to the DBs and safeties just needs a nice overhaul or a nice yelling at, I guess. I think they there are certain times where you can tell there's effort, but there's a lot of times where you can tell that they just are not going out there and playing the best that they can. And so hopefully Bill Bush can instill some more confidence, more fire into them that they can move forward and really, I don't know, moving into Big Ten play, at least play with a little gusto. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Zach for your thoughts on defense.
Yeah, I think you guys covered it pretty well overall. I mean, there's not much to really talk about. Defense was just bad. They had a graphic that came up on the TV, and I thought this was really telling that Nebraska gave up almost 200 yards by the second quarter. I think it was like 176 in the first quarter alone. Now, of course, that was all pretty well held up by that 61-yard run by Dylan Gabriel, but still, like that's bad. I don't think anybody can argue that that's not what you want to see in a defense. And not only that, going back to the Dylan Gabriel run, there were, I don't remember if it was radio or even TV or whatever, but I remember somebody telling me that it was one of the announcers wherever they were at said that Dylan Gabriel is not a running quarterback. And I mean, that was obvious if you watched him run. I mean, that's no disrespect to him. He's just meant to be more of a passing quarterback, which is totally fine. But he ran a 61-yard touchdown on our defense. We should have definitely had him stopped long before he got a touchdown. Maybe that was more of a credit to him for running that well, but you could just definitely tell defense looks lost. And I do think the firing of Chinander was warranted, was needed. A lot of people said it should have happened last year. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that personally speaking, because one of the things we've always talked about, the three of us, at least as fans, that has been our big problem in the past was the consistency. So even if like the coaches weren't necessarily looking like they were changing a whole lot, it was always kind of in the back of our minds to think, well, we don't want to change too much because if we start bringing in new coaches, the players aren't going to want to play under them because they were recruited by Chinander or whoever. Or we saw that issue with Mike Riley bringing in Diaco that last year. That's a whole different discussion too. But I think the same thing kind of applies here. I think we were trying to overcorrect and keep Chinander to keep that consistency going, which I thought at the time, at the end of last year, best 3-9 team in the country. We see where that led us, I guess, but no one really knows that going out of the end of the year. And to be fair to what we had thought, our defense did look a heck of a lot more improved last year. It was just the offense that couldn't get us to the end of the gate for the wins. Now it's switched this year, but it also kind of goes back to the whole idea of coaching, though, because now we're seeing that, yeah, we had great talent last year because we had I think 3 or 4 6-year seniors, and we were playing all upperclassmen basically for defense last year, which they, had time, they practiced, they had learned, they knew the scheme really well, they knew how to defense, I guess, if you will, at the end of the day. But now we're seeing the ripple effects starting, even that either we didn't prepare these kids to play or something, because it seems like the people that should be next in line were not ready at all, barring a couple, I guess. But still, it just I don't have a lot of positive to say personally. I was so unimpressed with the defense outside of the first drive or two, I guess. I don't remember when the second or 61-yard run came, but I was really impressed that we stopped them and got them to punt. And of course, as soon as I saw that, I think in the same vein as what you guys said, I told myself, hey, jokingly, I would like to point this out before anybody really wants to roast me. I was like, hey, guys, I think Nebraska might be back. And of course, as soon as I said that, I clearly must have ruined it. So,
I think we all
yeah,
said that after the first drive.
Yeah,
I
yeah, we're
and
pretty confident.
and you could tell, and you guys mentioned this too, like the emotion was there. You could tell that at least Mickey was riling the players up in a good way. He was getting them prepared, and the going back to the tunnel walk, which you already kind of discussed. That was, I mean, the tunnel walk is always kind of one of those, goosebump moments for me. I always think the tunnel walk is super cool. Um, and so like the tunnel walk just seemed like a unified unit coming out, even though it kind of always did, even with Scott here. But now, like, it's not really fair to Mickey either to be expecting too much of changes, but now we're seeing the changes come in, especially with the bye week. And so, again, I don't really have a whole lot of positives to say. I don't think there really were much. But I am excited to see where we can go with the defense. And I do really like the promotion for Bill Bush. I think I can't speak to his ability as a defensive coordinator specifically because I think he was an analyst before taking the special teams spot. But I
Yes, he
think
was
he's
last year because Scott decided not to hire anybody as a full-time special teams coach, and we know how that turned out.
well,
Oops.
and I mean, if we look at again our defense last year, again, I think held up by upperclassmen and stuff, but he probably has a pretty good idea of at least what we should be doing, and so I think Bill Bush will be a good choice to put there. But with that, I will pass it back to Andy, and we can keep going.
All right, yeah. So just a couple kind of quick cleaning up items from Sunday, the Saturday, the game, before we kind of get into more of the where do we go from here? Coaching search. We're gonna have to address Urban because that whole story's taken its own legs. As much as I said last time, I really, 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 really don't want to talk about Urban and I want to shut it down. Apparently, we have to still talk about it because everybody else wants to talk about it. So, to my dismay, we will touch on Urban a little bit, but that's about it. Kind of the biggest hit outside of what Mickey said after the game was Teddy Prohaska redshirting for the rest of the year, which, if you had any hope for offensive line sustaining some sort of blocking, Teddy was your guy, and we no longer have him for the rest of the year. So that just makes our offensive line much worse because now we don't have the one guy we knew was kind of going to be the more stable person on that offensive line is now redshirting for the rest of the year. I assume a medical redshirt because that's why he's redshirting the rest of the year for that as well. I know that Mickey had said after the game that he took accountability for the loss because he didn't have his players ready. It's very nice of him to say. We all know that is not true at all. None of the season or that loss is ever going to be on Mickey because he was thrust into this position. None of it's going to be his fault, but it's nice to see a much different personality between Scott speaking after a game after a loss versus Mickey speaking after a game after a loss. Just kind of the head coach mentality of, okay, I know what I have to do. I know what we did wrong. We got to fix it in practice and all that. Um, but yet again, that Scott also said that too, and obviously nothing changed. But we're also not holding this over Mickey's head that he takes all of the blame for this loss because, again, he was 5-6 days onto the job before he had to prepare for the biggest helmet game of the schedule, unless Michigan is like number 2 when we play them at that point, which they're on pace to be at this point. But with that there, I made a note that I was watching that game and thinking, especially after Chinander got fired now, my little joke was, what are we gonna we're gonna play the game of which coordinator or which coach is gonna be fired after the next game type thing. And I think we're just gonna do a survivor thing of each week one coach is just gonna get fired until we have nobody from Scott's tenure on staff anymore. Um, and like we said, Mickey's going to speak tomorrow on Tuesday, and I'm sure he'll be asked that. I'm sure he'll get addressed about the whole Chinander decision and all of that as well. But I am more curious about kind of heading into the future of where do we go from here now? How long are we going to see Scott's tenure affect this program? Obviously, the first thing is you have to clean house with all of Scott's guys that he brought in. I just think at this point, your head coach is gone, defensive coordinator's gone. We got rid of his friends from last year that he had brought from UCF with us to I think you have to start with the coaching staff. You just got to clean house. No matter who you bring in as a head coach, I think Mickey Joseph right now and maybe Mark Whipple, depending on how the rest of the season goes for the offense, I think might be the only guys you keep. Who knows if Mark Whipple wants to keep and stay, but I would appreciate if whoever they brought in, they would retain Mickey Joseph. I do think he's going to be good for us long term. Even if it's just an analyst recruiter type thing. I do hope, unless Mickey gets the head coaching job, that's also very much a possibility as well for that. But it to me, I had that thought of all these transfers that we brought in to save Scott's season they can work. It is good to have talented players. We see that Trey Palmer has emerged, Anthony Grant obviously has emerged, Casey has emerged when he has time to throw the ball. But it is one thing to bring in all this talent and all these players, and it's another thing that if you don't have an offensive line to block for your talented players, it defeats the purpose of bringing in these 4 to 5 star recruits if you can't get them the ball in time, if you can't block for them so they can make a 5-yard play into a 60-yard touchdown run. Anthony Grant's really good at that, and he's had probably to do a lot more than he has been asked to do because every time he gets the ball, he's already met at the line and he's got to bounce off and run it outside type thing. But I just don't. You got to get rid of all of Scott's coaches that he brought in. It's not good for the program in terms of a mental cultural state to keep all of the guys that he had brought in. It's you're going to see a ripple effect if you keep them. Now it's to be seen whether getting rid of Chinander and keeping Bill Bush is the defense is going to turn it around. I just don't expect it just because again, the players you put out there on the field are going to be the ones that win you the game, regardless of coaching. And again, this all the players that Scott had brought in to coach or not the coach, but to play defense are going to win you the game. And right now, it's not a good long-term solution to build a team on a transfer portal. I don't think it's feasible in the modern college football game right now. Who knows the transfer portal is also a fairly new thing for college football, especially with NIL now playing a big factor in that. But we know that all these transfers were brought in were a very short-term fix to save Scott's season. Same with the coaches that he brought in. They probably also knew that taking this job was a short-term fix to save Scott's season. And if things went south quickly, like they have, that they were not going to have a job. These players, I do feel bad for the players because all these coaches that have told them to come in, all they transferred to come in for a one-time shot have now everything's derailed off the rails for the time being. But it's one thing that Trev will need to look into for the future is you need to find a coach that builds around an offensive line or a defensive line or just like the lines in general. Because if you have your line solid, if you have a very solid offensive line, you can put players around there from the portal or you recruit them and develop them later. Wisconsin, Iowa are just two noticeable programs that are very good at doing that. Having a very solid offensive line and then finding a back like Braylon Allen. I mean, if you block for Braylon Allen, obviously you see what Wisconsin has done with the running game. So I hope that is one thing Trev does look for in a coach is you do not need a flashy coach to be a successful program. And not saying that we have to build our program like Wisconsin, like Iowa, but that is what the Big Ten is. It's very run heavy. It is very you win the game in the trenches in the Big Ten, no matter what team you play for. And as you obviously, we have looked at the offense for Iowa and Wisconsin. They are not very flashy. They are not spread offenses. They are not shotgun heavy. They're going to run the ball down your throat, and then they'll hit you with a play action and score type thing, or they'll just run the ball down your throat till they score. But that is kind of like my biggest thing of what Scott had done is he was more concerned about getting a talented receiver, quarterback, running back type players, and then you get them no offensive line to block, and it defeats the purpose of trying to get them the ball, because you can't get them the ball to make the play because you don't pass protect or you don't run block and all of that. But overall point being is we're just going to see just kind of how it's going to take at least a good 2 to 3 years if the players that transferred in don't transfer out of all the Scott's players to finally kind of leave the program and the new head coach to get his guys in. I think we will be feeling the effect of Scott's tenure for quite some time, um, just going forward. But with that, Nate, I'll hand it over to you. Just kind of your thoughts of where do we go from here, and if you want to touch on coaches or anything like that, you're more than welcome to.
Okay, yeah. So I think I guess the good base starting point is with Mickey's press conference. He took accountability for the loss, said it was on him, not really on the players. So I think that's a far cry from what we have seen in the past from Scott, from our previous head coach there. It's refreshing to hear, refreshing to see, even though it may be just kind of, coach speak, but it's refreshing to hear that he is taking the loss at least as hard as the kids are, and not just kind of blowing it off to, oh well, we were 1 or 2 plays away or something, the the typical colloquialisms that we're used to hearing. And so that was at least something positive from that press conference that I heard. And then we have one of the notes here that where Mickey says they're actually going to look at the film and see the players that are playing well and play them. And I think that's good. It's smart. It's something that we probably should have been doing anyways. It sounds, again, more rumor mill stuff, but it sounds like the previous tenure was more on their own guys, and they had certain favoritisms that they were playing. And so it's another good sign, I guess, that we're heading towards we're going to play the guys that are going to help us win the games, not oh, well, this person has XYZ name or something. We're going to look at them and play them just because I feel like it. And so, just from a coaching perspective, that's at least refreshing to hear, good to hear. Definitely some excitement there with that. But I agree with you, Andy. We're going to be seeing some of the effects of Frost's tenure for probably longer than we would like to. Ideally, we get in a new head coach who can kind of clean house, bring in his own recruits, bring in his own players, bring in his own coaches that will introduce at least a new culture to the program. But that obviously is going to depend on who we hire, when we hire them, and things of that nature. So that'll be interesting to see. And then with the transfer portal, I think it's interesting because it's certainly helpful. You can get some of your playmakers and kind of those fringe guys that you need to help bring the team together, but you need to have your own set of players that you recruit that actually you bring into the program and give you a solid base for the football team. You're not going to be finding your offensive linemen or defensive linemen, things like that, in the transfer portal. And so you need to be able to not only recruit a solid base, but you have to develop that base too, because it's not like we're starved for talent, because we've had top 20 recruiting classes for the past few years. It's not like we're starting 1 or 2 star guys on our offensive lines. Like these are 4-star players that, I mean, they may not be top tier, but they're good players, highly rated at their position. And so I think that really goes to show how poorly we've done at developing our talent that we have, because we have overall good players. It does come down to the coaching staff though, on how good those players end up becoming. And so whether Mickey gets it done or not, I think that's something that we really need to look at going forward, is how well these players improve in the face of adversity here, where we're 1-3, and seeing how they can respond to being kind of a bit of a laughingstock right now, and maybe not playing their best football, but if they can respond, finish out the season, even if it's not, on a big winning streak or anything, at least showing just improvement on both sides of the ball, tackling, wrapping up, blocking the guys you're supposed to, just little things, little fundamentals that hopefully we can fix here over the next few weeks. And so that's kind of, I guess, what I'm hoping to see looking forward. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Zach on any of his thoughts.
You bet. So for me, I think it's tough because obviously, like you guys both said, Mickey took accountability and he said that he was, the loss is on him, which, I don't agree with. He wasn't really going to be able to do much regardless. I mean, outside of a miracle. And I'm going to say any coach that came in could be the greatest college football coach of all time in the Nick Sabans and the Urban Meyers. And they weren't going to turn the Nebraska team around in 6 days to go out and beat Oklahoma. Uh, with that said, I think something that just kind of popped in my brain as just a good example of like how I felt about, regardless of how Mickey was going to do, after seeing how much we lost, in my head, I was like, it's really hard to host a fine China dinner party when all you're given is Tupperware, which I think is a really good way of looking at what Mickey was given for what he had to work with. I don't know. Maybe that's a saying somewhere, but I've never heard it. So I was like, I'm taking credit for that. But going to the transfer portal discussion that you guys had brought up, I think there can be a lot of good that comes out of the transfer portal. Not that you guys didn't say that, but I mean, you want a good example of transfer portal success is Michigan State. They have had great success in the portal. Obviously, they've taken what they've got from the transfer portal and been able to build upon it and develop. So I also
because Mel
think
Tucker is a very good coach.
correct. And so I think the transfer portal has really good prospects available for us. And, if Mickey's the next head coach or whoever the next head coach that comes in, we'll have a good foundation to build on, because if we get a good splash hire, and I don't mean like the sexy hire like we talked about last time, I'm saying just somebody that's got a name attached to them that people probably want to play for, we could see a lot of good transfer portal prospects. That said, I'm probably one of the guys that, as much as I like the transfer portal and I like the ranking systems, I have always kind of wondered how true they are. Case in point, I think we've got a fringe 5-star O-line offensive lineman on our team who has been here for a few years. And again, he missed how many blocks this last week. So, when I think of a fringe 5-star player, that's the farthest thing from it for me is missing blocks. I'm sorry, if you're going to be an almost 5-star recruit, you're not missing blocks. You're going to be the one that's telling the rest of the team where they missed their blocks. But I digress. That's a whole different discussion, and I obviously don't work on the stats side of that, so I can't speak to what goes into those rankings, or at least confidently I can't. I think there's a lot of good that's going to come moving forward, though. Obviously, we're seeing Mickey make his changes, and we're seeing that he's taking control of the team like Trev said he would. I do like that. I like the accountability, and yeah, I mean the ripple effects are gonna. I do think the ripple effects are still going to be present. I think on the other side of that, though, going back to the transfer portal, and if we get good coaches that develop, we may not see it as long as we think. It might only be a year or two, but it's going to probably be a rough go of things for at least a year or two, and I think that would be fair, depending on who we get, I guess. And then I know Andy's already talked about it, and I know Nate mentioned it last week too, but just because I remember I never said anything about it on the Urban train. I do not want Urban Meyer, but I am very conflicted on the prospect of Urban Meyer because I look at it as two separate parts of what we get of Urban Meyer. Because the on-field work that he would do he's obviously up there as a top coach. Looking just specifically at the football aspect, if we want a football coach that can win, Urban Meyer is one that would do it. I mean, outside of him, the likelihood of us getting Nick Saban is pretty low, I think. So, he might be one to look at if we're talking just football. Unfortunately, what comes with him there is, the baggage. That's the part that I don't want. But who knows? Maybe if he actually decides that he wants to come here, which there have been a lot of rumors and stuff that not rumors, sorry, there have been a lot of reports saying that Urban Meyer is shutting down the talks, that he doesn't have interest or that he wasn't contacted or however the reports are saying. I do think it would be wild of Trev to not call him and talk to him just in a consulting role. That's not going to be a head coach. So
Right, and I agree
that
with that. If because that report came out Saturday, it's like, oh, Urban was spotted talking to like Trev Alberts and contract of the Nebraska job, and then that tweet yesterday came out and said no, he's going to remain at Fox. He's not interested at coaching again. And there's a couple points with that. Is I'm not sure Urban will even wants to be a rebuilding coach at all. Because if any coach that comes here, you're gonna have to rebuild. Outside of I think like his stint at Utah, I don't think Urban has ever had to come in and rebuild a team. I don't. I'd have to double check with Florida, but I know for Ohio State at least, he was just kind of handed the keys, kind of like he did with Ryan Day. And obviously they're still going. And I just don't think Urban wants to be a rebuilding coach. He just kind of wants what Scott did, just get handed the title of head coach and just be a coach and not do all the extra things that a head coach should do. Um, but yeah, there is that aspect you're looking at is short-term success versus long-term success. Short-term, yes, Urban would technically be a better coach if you want to for sure 8-9 win season right off the bat, or maybe not right off the bat, but at least short-term wise. But the long term of this is you're probably going to be doing this again in 4 years of looking for another coach. And I'm sure Trev has taken that into account. And, if he has contacted Urban, I hope it's more of a consulting role, like you said, Zach, of, hey, who are your contacts? Who do you think I should reach out to talk to you about finding the next guy for Nebraska? Urban obviously has been around the league, both college and NFL, for a very short time in the NFL, might I add. But Urban probably still has a lot of contacts. There's a lot of guys that he could get Trev in contact with just for any sort of consulting idea of who is the best character, who's the best guy that I should bring in for this job. So I hope if there's any sort of report like that, that's what it's been for and not in serious consideration for the job, because I will lose my mind if that happens.
Well, and then going to the long-term point, and I know we've all kind of discussed this, and again, I'm reiterating, I don't necessarily want Urban Meyer myself, but I do think there are some things you got to look at. He could do like he did at Ohio State with Ryan Day, where he brings in some extra good coaches and he develops our players, and he says, hey, 4 or 5 years is his mark, and he could be upfront about that. And he's like, I don't want to coach the rest of my life, but I think I've got a good shot with this Nebraska job to rebuild it and then hand the keys to somebody else and say, here you go, keep it going. And I like, Ryan Day is a perfect example of that. He's done fantastic with Ohio State. I don't think anybody's going to argue that point, but I still don't want him to come here just with everything else that goes with it. I do think there's a lot of good that could come from talking to him and, having discussions with him if you're Trev Alberts, but we don't get paid to make those decisions, so our opinions are just that.
My thought of with all those clips Saturday of the students and like younger kids yelling, "We want Urban" at the Fox Big Ten or Big Noon kickoff show, and I sat back and I'm like, well, thank goodness an adult is making this decision for us and not a bunch of 18 to 21-year-olds shouting, "We want Urban."
And it's tough too because like as an early 90s kid, I was barely, cognizant in terms of memory of the Huskers being great. I vaguely remember 97, which was a great year for Husker football. But I'm saying I vaguely remember it because I didn't understand what was going on to a great level. And so I get it. Like, wouldn't it be great if all of a sudden Nebraska could come back and be in a great bowl? And I mean, playoff contention's a lot to ask, right? Within the next couple of years. But wouldn't it be great if in our lifetimes we could see that? But I think we will. And again, I mean, this is bigger than the Urban discussion. I think we will see it. And I'm just saying, maybe not even just not playoff contention, just maybe bowl or championship. I think we will see it because I think Trev is going to take it very serious about who he wants to bring in and who he wants to run the program with that long-term success and that sustainability. But with that, and depending on who we hire, it's going to be kind of like we all said with Scott too. He's going to need I remember saying specifically, like, he needs at least 5 years to get his program in place. I mean,
He got kind of
failed.
5 years.
He
He
did.
got his
I mean,
program in place, that's for sure.
he did, and failed experiment, and all. But I feel like Nebraska gave him the long enough leash because I don't necessarily want to be the rumor mill as a podcast by any means, but something that I keep seeing that's floating around is that Trev wanted to fire him at the end of last year and didn't have booster support.
So did I.
And and apparently all it took was, losing to Georgia Southern to say, okay, yeah, now we support the decision. Like, fine, but why didn't we think about this sooner? But that is what it is. I'm not going to get too deep into that. We could be here forever. So with that, I will finally pass it back to Andy and let you discuss.
We will, just I think one last point we'll wrap it up with. We could save a couple of our other points for our next episode, our bye-week episode here, in terms of just more coaching discussion and all of that. But quick note on that, Lance Leipold looks pretty cool right now. He's got Kansas off to a 3-0 start, so we'll keep an eye on that going forward.
But he's at Kansas. Do we really want that?
Well, Kansas beat Texas last year, obviously great,
Yeah, they did.
and they almost
Hey,
beat Oklahoma last year. So we'll see what they do this year against them again.
Hey, I'm just kidding. But he does look like a good prospect. If I'm being honest, I think he looks good.
But the last point I had here was we are officially a third of the way through the Husker season. Whether you are happy or sad about that, probably most of us just want the season to be over already because it's already a train wreck. But 4 games in, 8 more to go, entering now all of the rest of the Big Ten schedule here. And we thought, we should probably revisit our season predictions because they are not going as well right now. I remember Nate said he was 9-3. I was 6-6. Zach, what were you again?
I believe either 6-6 or 7-5.
Okay, so we're all technically not done yet, although Nate is probably the closest to being done. Yeah.
I
But
need to drink a lot more Kool-Aid for my prediction to come out correct.
But yeah, so just in terms of revisiting now, we're 4 games in. We've kind of seen what has happened so far through 4 games, and 6-6, 9-3, 6-6, or 7-5, still on the table for all of us. Nate's probably not going to happen. I don't even know if Zach and I's are going to happen at this rate. There is a very realistic possibility we are looking at 1-11 straight in the face. If that is, I don't even know how I'll feel about that. But it's certainly on the table that we could go 1-11. I will revise mine a little bit. I'm scared to say 4 wins because I don't know where the other 3 come from. But I'm gonna go anywhere from 3-9 again to 4-8, kind of for my final season prediction there. I do think that looking at Indiana and Rutgers, those are the most winnable games on the rest of the schedule here. I know Purdue kind of had that scare. No, they did lose to Syracuse. Indiana had that scare, but won in overtime against Western Kentucky on Saturday. Purdue did lose to Syracuse, but again, any team that plays us, like Zach had mentioned it before, looks like a playoff contender team anytime they play us. So nothing's a guaranteed win, but in terms of the rest of the schedule, the most winnable games are your next 2 games against Indiana and Rutgers. But I will go anywhere from 3-9 to 4-8, and then I will adjust as we go on. How about you, Nate?
Yeah, so someone was a little optimistic this season. Man, staring down the schedule early or late August when we were first starting, I was like, Northwestern, North Dakota, Georgia Southern, easy 3-win rattle off. Keep it close against Oklahoma. Indiana, Rutgers, Purdue, Illinois, all winnable games.
And a quick note on
now,
that. Northwestern loss looks real bad to us right now, too, because they are also their only win was against Nebraska,
Yep.
losing to Duke and FCS Southern Illinois. But continue, Nate.
I mean, in good news, North Dakota is ranked number 19 in the FCS now, so they just beat Northern Arizona last week, so they're at least moving up the ranks in the FCS, which is a positive for our one win on the season so far. But I would say I'm still going to lean optimistic. I think like I said, we got a bye week coming up. Scott Frost was notoriously bad coming out of a bye week, so I feel like Mickey Joseph has to know that and will come out swinging against Indiana. It's a home game, it's homecoming, night game in Memorial Stadium. I think that's going to pay some dividends for us, and I think we can end up 4-8. I think that's where I think it's gonna have to come. Our 3 wins are gonna have to come in the next 4 games with Indiana, Rutgers, Purdue, Illinois. Because after that, it gets pretty tough. But I think we can pull 3 wins out of there.
You said optimistic, and I
I'll-
thought you were talking about 7-5 or something like
8
that.
and
I'm like,
4.
all right.
I was
Lock it in.
waiting. I was waiting for 6-6 at minimum. I was like,
Yeah.
optimistic.
Obviously, I would love if we could make a bowl game. Mickey could ride off to the sunset on that. But I realistically, unless our defense shows some market improvement, I think that we're going to be staring another losing record in the face at the end of the year. So with that, I'll pass it over to Zach.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much on the same train as you, with a point that was kind of brought up, but I'm just going to summarize what Andy was basically saying there. Is that the Big Ten West this year has been pretty weak, even
Unless you're Minnesota.
unless you're Minnesota.
Yeah,
With-
Minnesota's also played some teams.
Fair point.
Not to take anything away from them. I think they're going to crush us. But
You think?
I have this thing called a run game that scares me.
So does Wisconsin.
Yeah, those 2 games are going to be brutal. But I do think the Big Ten West, not for Nebraska being winnable, but I do think there are chances to eke out some wins. And that's about the best I'm going to be able to say is I think we're going to eke out some wins. But I think 4-8 is about the highest I'm going to go as well. I don't think Mickey was just given enough to really turn the team around. But, I would love to be proven wrong. If he goes and he gets us to a bowl game, I would absolutely, I will 100% say I was wrong and take that one in the face because, we haven't been to a bowl game for years, which is so sad to say, but we haven't been to a bowl game for however many years. It's
Mike Riley, 2017, baby.
Oh man, that's a long time. And something else that we can discuss further in the bye week, but something that we should make sure that if you're not aware of, if you listen to us, is that we are not the only team in college football right now that's going to be gunning for a new head coach, as Herm Edwards at Arizona State also got fired after this last weekend. He woke up on NCAA Survivor, and they said, "You're gone from the island." So,
did you?
Nebraska's
see that video
not the only one
that came out? There was a video somewhere on Twitter of Herm Edwards walking off the field after their game Saturday, and immediately talking to both the chancellor and the athletic, the AD for Arizona State. And I think the comment of that video was, did they just fire him right on the spot on the field? It's so funny.
I didn't see that, but maybe he was just given his ticket to the boat right there that day instead of Sunday, like most Survivor works. But anyway, just something to keep in mind as we definitely, the 3 of us, go ahead with our discussions of who we think the next head coach is going to be. Obviously, I'm sure there's going to be some other head coaches that get let go this year too. So, it's not, there's no way Nebraska's going to be the only one that's going to be looking for a new head coach, which would be great if we were, though. But thanks to Herm and his wonderful coaching, now it's not a possibility. So with that, I will give the reins back to Andy.
All right. So just wrapping up the program here for the podcast. yeah, we're gonna win the bye week. There's no way we can lose it. I don't think.
Hold
If
on,
we
let's
if
slow down there.
if we find a way to lose it, I would love to know how we lose it. But yeah, bye week this coming week for Nebraska. So their next game that just got announced. The kickoff time 6:30 on BTN against Indiana next weekend. Homecoming game for Nebraska, like Nate said, night game at Memorial Stadium always just adds a little bit of juice for the program. It I want to say it did for Georgia Southern, but also it didn't because that was an atrocious game to watch. But either way, so, with that, you can always find us on our Facebook and Twitter pages for the Nebraskabilities podcast. You can always let us know your thoughts anytime. Just a couple of notes for kind of the bye week podcast. We will be talking about the college football playoff expansion that they had announced a couple weeks ago, expanding to 12 teams. Hopefully by 2026, I think is when they said probably it would be initiated. And then we'll also talk some conference expansion as well. Obviously, the notable ones for the Big Ten of UCLA and USC coming to the Big Ten in 2024. We'll also talk about just kind of the Big 12 in the next coming years, the TV contract deals, kind of the shape and landscape of what college football is going for as well. Any final thoughts, boys?
Just one, and it goes into the socials. If you have anything that you'd like us to discuss, as I know we've all gotten questions and texts from people, if you have anything you'd like us to discuss on the podcast that you want to hear our thoughts on, make sure you follow us on our socials and let us know what those thoughts are, because without you guys letting us know via those channels, we aren't going to be able to talk about it. And the bye week discussion is going to be a great long one. So, make sure you tune into that. But if you got something you want to hear that we haven't touched on yet, let us know via those socials. That's all from me.
Anything else, Nate?
Not too much. You mentioned we're probably going to win this bye week, so
We hope.
I've already got my Kool-Aid ready, and I think we're going to be going into Indiana on a good foot. So I'll just leave it with a go Big Red, and I'll let you finish off here.
I love how it's probably, by the way, Nate. We're probably going to win. But the fact that we're so jaded as a fan base is that now we're saying we don't even know if we'll win the bye week. Like,
Yep.
That's where we're at.
Yep. And obviously, if anything else comes out of Mickey's press conference tomorrow on Tuesday, we will address that during the podcast for the bye week podcast. Or if anything else in terms of the team shows up, we will address that as well. But for your host, I am Andy. Those are my co-hosts, Zach and Nate. And remember, as always, if it's a possibility, it is a Nebraskability.